Good afternoon. Great to be here, and welcome to the sordid history of political correctness. I always feel like there should be a big thunderclap after I say that. But let's get started. I like to begin with a couple of quotes, actually. In 2015, following the attacks on the Bataclan Theater in Paris, Peggy Noonan from the Wall Street Journal took to the airwaves and she said the following: "We've done a bad job of teaching our children what it is we stand for, where we came from, and what our values of freedom are. The kids on these college campuses don't seem to understand what the First Amendment is or how precious our freedom of thought is." Also on that same day, I have one more, Dr. Zuni Jasser from the American Islamic Center for Democracy said the following: "American constitutionalism and American patriotism needs to lead the way in who we are. We've been strangled by rules of political correctness, and that delusion in our society has to stop for our values of freedom to survive." I think those two quotes are very apt quotes to begin today's conversation with about what political correctness is, who it came from, and where it's brought us to today. So what is political correctness? The dictionary definition, which I like to start with, says that it's conforming belief that language practices which could offend political sensibilities should be eliminated. Now, this phrase, political correctness, actually first came onto the scene in the 1990s when we first started hearing it, and it brought about with it this idea of a victimhood mentality. It also brought the notion that somehow not being offended is a civil right. And it brought about with it the expectation that if you do not prescribe and accept the politically correct narratives, you should be shut down completely and utterly. And this is the America that a lot of people know. But that's not the America that you and I know. The America that you and I know is born out of an idea that was unique in the history of the world. A radical idea of the inalienable rights of the individual. Our founding fathers risked their fortunes, their reputations, and their very lives and lives of their family to deliver the human condition from one of tyranny to one of liberty. And amen to that. That's how it should be. But what you're going to discover in the next 60 minutes is that political correctness is actually just a symptom of something much larger and more deliberate. America is like a healthy body, and its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within. You may have heard that quote before, and that's largely attributed to Joseph Stalin, although no one is really sure if he actually said it or not. But whether he said it or someone else did, the truth of that statement can't be denied. What we do know for sure is that today, political correctness and the erosion of free speech has invaded every aspect of American culture. Today, we're at a critical tipping point in our nation's history. We have come very far on a long journey from liberty back to tyranny. And just how that journey ends has yet to be decided. And just how that journey ends depends on you. Depends on you.
Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. The story isn't over. You and the audience are part of the conflict.
You and the audience are part of the conflict. Isn't that the truth? All right, so our journey begins in 1884 in America. We're 20 years or so outside of the Civil War. Grover Cleveland is elected president that year. He's the first Democrat president to be elected in almost 30 years. And the Washington Monument is completed this year, making it the tallest building in the world for that time. And we're on the dawn of the 20th century. And although we don't know it yet, thanks to free enterprise and free society, we are about to enter an age of innovation and productivity, the likes of which the world has never seen. We are about to grow the largest middle class that has ever existed. It's a good time to be American. Now, across the pond in England in 1884, something very different was happening. There was a perfect storm brewing of a lot of different beliefs and philosophies and culture that allowed the seeds of political correctness to take root. So enter the Fabian Society, named after Roman General Fabius, who was actually famous for wearing down his victims over a long period of time. And then, when his enemy was so tired and worn out and had no more fight in them, he crushed them utterly. Notice the wolf in sheep's clothing as their shield. So this is the year that the Fabian Society formed its philosophies and actually became established. And there are a lot of famous Fabians. We'll talk about them throughout this discussion, H.G. Wells being one, and we'll have a look at that. The Fabians believed in socialism. They believed in the nationalization of the economy and ultimately a one-world government. This was the home run of the Fabians, was achieving one world government. And as they were forming their philosophy, they drew upon a lot of different philosophies and beliefs of their day that people were learning to gain acceptance and believe in. So let's look at some of their influences. The utilitarians, formed by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Now, it says philosophical radicals. You may be wondering why that is. We remember John Stuart Mill as being very pro-democracy and actually pro-America, and indeed he was. These gentlemen also believed, however, that happiness should be the standard of measurement for what's right and wrong in society, rather than rule of law or natural law. And as I said, they were pro-democracy, and because of that, they believed that the majority rule should determine what constitutes happiness. They developed something known as welfare utilitarianism. That means whatever makes people happy is good, and therefore that should be made available to people by the government, right? Then I guess by that logic, everyone would be happy. I mean, I'm not sure, but that's what they thought. So the utilitarians focused on reform, and that meant reforming schools, prisons, churches. Even the Constitution of the United States was open to the discussion about reforming it. And because they championed democracy, the utilitarians made reform palatable. This was the first time people were really talking about the idea of reform and change. Now, the physiocrats were founded by Henry George, that fella right there, and they believed that he believed, and the physiocrats believed that people could legitimately own property if you created it. So you were allowed to have value and ownership, but only in something that was created. So they believed that certain things like air, water, and land were not created by mankind, and therefore no human being should be allowed to own any of that. So Henry George and the physiocrats' solution was the government should therefore be the custodian of land and property and dole it out for the use by humans, but that no one should actually have land ownership. Another influence of the Fabians when they were forming the society were the gradualists. That's Sir Edmund Burke. Now, you may remember Sir Edmund Burke for saying, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. It's absolutely true. But what he also believed and knew and understood is that fundamental changes to the government should be implemented discreetly and over time. And that's key to our journey on political correctness, because the Fabian Society understood that their goals to nationalize the economy, their ultimate goal of a one-world government, and so forth, would take a long time. They understood that, and they were willing to forge an agenda around that very fact. So as such, they created a logo. In addition to their wolf in sheep's clothing, they created a logo called the Fabian tortoise. And it's a cartoon of a very angry-looking tortoise waving his, what do you call that, his stump? Waving his paw in the air. And it says, "When I strike hard." So they understood. Our mission will take a long time, but we're in it for the long haul. And when we're ready to strike, it will be hard. Charles Darwin also really paved the way for the Fabians' philosophies to be accepted in society in England, because Charles Darwin was also putting forth theories to the public that said, look, everything is always changing, and change does take a long time. So that theory was very compatible and consistent with what the Fabians wanted people to believe in terms of being open to reforms, especially of the government. Utopianism also helped. And as I mentioned, there were some famous Fabians like H.G. Wells. There was also later Virginia Woolf and George Bernard Shaw, who you might be familiar with as well. Utopians really provided sort of the pop culture of the day, if you will. They provided paintings, books, and plays. And through these paintings, books, and plays, they painted idyllic pictures of a utopian society and how wonderful and happy and self-actualized we would all be if we only lived in a world where none of us owned anything and everyone had equal amounts of whatever we needed, right? This was a very popular trend at this time in pop culture. So the utopians, again, helped pave the way of acceptance for the philosophy that the Fabians were espousing. Now, you can't mention the Fabian Society or socialism or one world government goals without paying homage to Karl Marx, of course, because what did Karl Marx believe? He had some radical ideas, too, that were not inconsistent with the Fabians' goals. But as you may remember the phrase, workers of the world unite, Karl Marx believed that the oppressed proletariat would one day become so fed up with their plight that they would revolt against their governments. And at that time, and the workers of the world would drop the barriers of countries and unite together as one body, then you could tear down the existing governmental systems and replace them with Marxist ideology. So that was his thinking.
Karl Marx believed that you would have a rebellion by the workers against the capitalist system, which would then create a Marxist communist society where you would have dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. So this is all the different philosophies that the Fabians drew upon in their day in order to try and advance their goals. There was one problem, though. People weren't really responding to this whole economic change theory. And Karl Marx had a similar problem because the workers of the world did not unite. As a matter of fact, when the world wars came, what did they do? They took up arms in defense of their countries, of their respective countries, and nationalism became popular. Patriotism became popular. So Karl Marx and the Fabians, I mean, essentially in today's terms, we would say they had a branding problem. So in 1923, Marxism and the Fabians, who were working quietly at the same time, kind of got a makeover, really. Because in 1923, a man named Carl Grunberg and Felix Weil were working at a place called the Institute for Social Research. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? They were in Germany, and they were busy trying to figure out how to spread socialism across Europe at the Institute when a man named Max Horkheimer took over. And the first thing he did was he renamed it the Frankfurt School because it was based in Frankfurt, Germany. And then he said, you know what we need to do, guys? We need to shift our focus because the economy is a difficult thing to explain to people, and they're not responding. We need to shift our focus from economic change to cultural transformation. When we change the culture, we can then change the economy and the structure of our government. So what he proposed was nothing less than brilliant. What he proposed was to integrate the views of Karl Marx with Sigmund Freud. And this was the beginning of the idea of cultural revolution, 1923 in Germany.
The solution, according to the Frankfurt School, was not just a political revolution to overthrow capitalism, but a social and cultural revolution as well.
Social and cultural revolution. This was the plan. So, armed with a new name and a new vision, Horkheimer assembled his Marxist-Leninist dream team: Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and a man named Erich Fromm. Now together, these Marxist socialist all-stars would develop their theories for social change. Does that sound familiar? And psychological revolution. And they had a goal. It was to detach the culture from any moral anchors whatsoever. Because as I said, if you detach the culture from their moral anchors, if you remove and strip away the values and principles that people have, there's a vacuum. And what happens in nature when there's a vacuum? They can come in and they can replace those values with the new values that are consistent with their goals. So this was the plan. Now what's interesting is that's Herbert Marcuse that you see in this picture. Obviously it's in color, so it wasn't from 1930, but I'm going to show you a clip right now of an interview that he's in, and it's fascinating because he's reflecting on this time in 1930, between 1923 and 1930, when he and his colleagues were formulating this strategy to utilize psychology to influence and change the points of view, the outlook, and the values of society. Listen to what he says.
One of the most striking phenomena to see to what extent the ruling power structure could manipulate, manage, and control not only the consciousness, but also the subconscious and unconscious of the individuals. Therefore, my friends at the Frankfurt School considered psychology one of the main branches of knowledge that had to be integrated with Marxian theory.
So there you have it. It's very clearly laid out. It's not a secret. And did you notice that he said the degree to which the conscious and subconscious mind could be influenced? So this was part of their key strategy. So in 1935, socialism comes to America. Now, how did that happen? Because the Frankfurt School had their plan, they had a clear mission, they had a clear strategy, they had a great team to do it, and they might have just implemented their plans in Europe, but World War II came. And when Hitler rose to power, the Frankfurt School packed up its bags, and by way of a few other countries, they ended up settling in New York City at Columbia University. Not surprisingly, the ivy-covered halls and the academic elites opened the socialist theories and Marxist ideologies with open arms. They were fascinated. And this whole idea of communism, socialism, Marxism became trendy in our academic elite system. So it was at Columbia University from 1930 on that the Frankfurt School found its home and completed its most important work in the United States of America. So of course, naturally, their shift moved from transforming Europe and cultural society there to transforming the United States of America. Makes sense. There was only one problem. In America, even though the academic elites were fascinated by socialism and James and Ethel Rosenberg, and there were conversations in coffee houses among the intelligentsia, the working middle class America wasn't biting. They liked capitalism. Capitalism was working. We had the largest middle class in the history of the world. So what did the people at the Frankfurt School do? They were patient, like that Fabian tortoise. For 20 years, Herbert Marcuse and his team worked on finding a surrogate for the middle class. They knew they had to divide the middle class into different groups that could then individually be targeted and victimized. And if you can victimize a group of people, now you can start to tear down their ideals and replace them with your own, which of course will be the solutions to their problems. So this was how the first plans really hatched for instilling a victim mentality into our culture, was with the Frankfurt School.
Rather than workers uniting and marching into battle, thus seizing power through force, they would make a long march through the institutions. Institutions like the arts, cinema, theater, literature, schools, college, seminaries, newspapers, magazines, and what is now known as radio, TV, and the mass media. Once this march is over, all the barriers to the acceptance of Marxism will have been quietly and systematically removed.
This was the plan by the Frankfurt School to transform our culture by tearing down values, was to change the pop culture, change the way our entertainment talked to us. So in 1937, the Frankfurt School came up with this idea written by Max Horkheimer called critical theory. In critical theory, he described it as liberating human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. That sounds great, right? Who doesn't want to be liberated? But when you read about critical theory, actually what it is to tear down Western values by criticizing absolutely everything. Does that sound familiar? So you tear down the notion of home is where the heart is, father knows best, the notions of family, God, and country, things of this nature. And then you replace those values with values that divide. Father's oppressive, God is dead, right? The founding fathers were these white supremacist racists. America's dominated by an establishment that we have to rail against, things like that. So this was the plan.
Critical theory. The term critical theory is something of a play on words. One is tempted to ask, what is the theory? The answer is, the theory is to criticize. Through unremitting, destructive criticism of every institution of Western society, they hope to bring that society down.
Okay, so there you have it. And the interesting thing is, none of this was happening in secret. It's just that Americans are busy getting on with their lives of working, having families, going to church, doing all the things that we do. But this was going on at the same time. So in 1930, remember I mentioned famous Fabian socialist H.G. Wells, who was quite a celebrity at the time? He talks about this new world order. And he says, this new and complete revolution we contemplate can be defined in very few words. It is outright world socialism, scientifically planned and directed. So again, not a secret. He also said, there's no choice before mankind but a worldwide control of power and production, and that the supreme task before our awakened minds is the re-education of the world. The re-education of the world. It has an interesting meaning, doesn't it, sitting here today and hearing it now. So, 1945, this was an important year because since the 20s, right, the Fabian Society had been working in the background in parallel, not in consort with, but in parallel to the goals of the Frankfurt School in the United States. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Virginia Woolf, other celebrities that I mentioned were working, and together the Fabians were actually influential in the formation of the International Court at The Hague and the League of Nations. And why is 1945 important? Because that's the year that the League of Nations officially became the United Nations, because that's the year that the United Nations got their charter. So in 1945, H.G. Wells took to the airwaves again, went on the radio, and I'm gonna share this soundbite with you of what he said from the radio. Don't be alarmed by his high voice; it's rather distracting. But there's also, the quote is also written so that you can read it at the same time. So this is what he said in response to the official birth of the United Nations.
30 years ago, to think of one super government throughout the world was an impossible dream. Now it is an imperative necessity.
So there you have it. Their impossible dream has become an imperative necessity. So 1955, we're moving along in the 20th century now. Herbert Marcuse from the Frankfurt School writes a book called Eros and Civilization. And in there, it talks about something called a polymorphous perversity, which was really the first implementation in the field, the practical application of zeroing in on a victim group. right? Because remember, there were these sections of different groups that were going to be victimized, and this was the first one.
Martin Jay confirms the role of the Frankfurt School in creating the victim groups that constitute the politically correct coalition.
But the working class wouldn't play the hegemonic role that traditional Marxism had expected from it. And so students, blacks, other minority groups, women, and so forth were, they hoped at least, able to come together.
Of critical importance for the injection of the Frankfurt School's work into the student rebellion of the 1960s was Marcuse's revival of Fromm's notion of sexual liberation.
Marcuse, however, was the main conduit of ideas. But Marcuse had written one important work in the 1950s called Eros and Civilization, a work which attempted to rub Freud against the grain and come out with a radical, even utopian reading of psychoanalysis.
So that's 1955. So this is the first part now where they're implementing their plan, right, of the victim groups. Now here we are in the 60s. Sexual revolution, Saul Alinsky. So I like to say if Herbert Marcuse was the architect of political correctness, Saul Alinsky was the hammer and nails. He was the field guy who really went out there and organized the victim groups. He incited them. He was fuel on their fire. He instilled the victim mentality. So he was a good foot soldier, whether he realized it or not. And he also, as we know, created the professional community organizer. So this was a much better way to be effective at all of these kinds of grassroots effort to create victim mentality and victimhood. Saul Alinsky said in his book, Rules for Radicals, the first job of an organizer is to create the problem. He didn't say identify the problem. He said create the problem. And Saul Alinsky was very good at that. So he was a perfect enabler and a perfect conduit for the goals of the Frankfurt School that had been really established since 1884, but also really coming into fruition in the 1950s. Now we come to the 70s. Things are really moving along because in the 60s there was a lot of debate about victimization, victimhood, feminism, race, all of these things. There was debate. Now in the 70s, we start to get some acceptance. This is the era of the sensitive man. We have Phil Donahue and Alan Alda and a lot of movies where men are being sensitive and crying. This was part of the talk of feminism in the 70s. Feminists Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon were really vocal about their ideas of what feminism was and should be, and they paved the way for this debate. They saw men as threats of domination. Andrea Dworkin, who passed away in 2005, said that heterosexual sex is an affront to women. And Catherine McKinnon in 1989 published a book called Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, which draws parallels between the sexual oppression of women and the Marxist notions of class struggle. So that's very important because this is where the victimization of women is being compared to Marxist class struggle. So we're starting to insert political ideology into the value system chain. Now in the 1980s, you get an emergence of an even more powerful kind of super community organizer, if you will. Frank Marshall Davis was from Chicago. He was a huge influence on a young man named Barack Obama who grew up there, as well as other people who became quite high up in public life. Hillary Clinton, she was also someone who studied Saul Alinsky, Frank Marshall Davis, and other radicals of their time. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama refers to Frank Marshall Davis as Uncle Frank, because that was the kind of close relationship that they had. So who was this guy? Who was Frank Marshall Davis? Well, he visualized a world of a classless society, which sounds very good. But in order to have a classless society, you do have to strip away competition, freedom of choice, property ownership, many things that are the foundations and bedrock of a free society. He also said that his, quote, sole criterion was to wipe out white supremacy. So these were the kinds of influences, ideas that he had that influenced some of the people who are very high up in our country and public life today. the 1980s. Now in the 1990s, remember the Fabian tortoise? Well, now he strikes. Now the Fabian tortoise strikes hard. How? Now we're saying it. We're speaking the word, political correctness. And we are moved from the victim groups, which people have now come to accept and believe, to obligation. And what do I mean by that? Political correctness is accepted in American culture because of certain conduits that are introduced. Environmentalism becomes one of the major ways in which this system of political correctness is to be ushered in and train people on how a good global citizen should behave. Because remember now, we are replacing the values that we've torn down. That's the agenda of the Frankfurt School, and it's being implemented rather seamlessly. The concept of a global citizen is another phrase that takes root. People start talking about that. And of course, with the internet coming into play, people are starting to expand their awareness of being global citizens. A man named Harvey Reuven at the time was vice chair of the International Council on Environmental Initiatives, and he said very plainly, the individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective, plain and simple. And think about his title. Do you see that? He's the vice chair of the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. I mean, think about that. So now we're in the 2000s. The agenda is really moving along because now we move again, like I said, from victimization to obligation. You're obligated to know what these issues are about. You're obligated to know what these narratives and what's important in political correctness movement. Now in the 2000s, we implement the next phase, which is liberating tolerance. Again, this was something conceived of by Herbert Marcuse. And really liberating tolerance, what it is the end of the debate. You move from obligation to compliance, meaning it's not just enough anymore to know, oh, what is this political correctness? What are these issues they're telling me that I need to be concerned about? To compliance. You're expected to comply. You're expected to understand and comply with the narratives of political correctness now. You know, such as innocuous things like recycling, right? Or believing in global warming. Or believing that fossil fuels are bad. You're not only expected to be aware of that now, you are expected to comply. Now we also move from compliance in the 2000s to loyalty. It's not enough that you comply. You should believe this stuff. You should believe this stuff or there's something wrong with you. And it's not only enough anymore to be loyal. I mean, sure, you're loyal, right? You believe it. But now, like a good shepherd of the political correctness flock, you need to go out there and witness to others and recruit people. You must be an activist for this politically correct narrative. That's the expectation in the 2000s. And like I said, with the internet and social media now, that toothpaste is long out of the tube. Political correctness starts growing exponentially, and nobody can control it.
Marcuse is also the source of one of political correctness's most notable characteristics, its total intolerance for any viewpoint but its own. Marcuse argued that our free American society was actually a deception, that its true tolerance is somehow repressive, while he argued for something called liberating tolerance.
And what he meant by that was liberating toleration or liberating tolerance meant intolerance from ideas and movements from the right and tolerance for any ideas from the left.
So there you have it, liberating tolerance, packaged with a nice name, something very different. Now, 2008 was an interesting year, rather important in our history. A man named Jerry Boyer is a contributor to Forbes.com, and he wrote an article called Barack Obama, Fabian Socialist. And isn't that interesting? Because Fabians had been around ever since 1884, but you never hear that term. You never talk about it. We don't see it in the media. No one talked about Fabian socialism in 2008. But this man, Jerry Boyer, did. And he made some very interesting predictions at the onset of the Obama administration in 2008 and said, here is what I, Jerry Boyer, predict this administration will prioritize and do. Now, as I go through this, consider the year we're in now, looking back and seeing everything that he predicted and what has actually transpired. He says, so here's the playbook. The left will identify, freeze, personalize, and polarize an industry such as healthcare, education, energy, or the police force. It will attempt to nationalize 1/5 of the U.S. economy through legislative action or executive order. An industry won't be nationalized in one fell swoop. Instead, a parallel system will be created, with the old system forced to subsidize the new one. Where have we seen this? With energy. Traditional energy sources, just last year, I think it was, and I think it was through executive action, it might have been some other term, but Barack Obama implemented some kind of a surcharge onto traditional energy sources, such as coal and oil, to subsidize green energy like wind and solar. That's exactly what he did. Jerry Boyer also predicted that the Fabian MO of the administration will be relentless journalistic and cultural attacks on everything that is, and then a hard pitch for the hope of what might be. Right? Because like Goodalinskyite, you have to first create the problem. In concert with pop culture outlets like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live, Obama will use his podium to humiliate and demonize those of us who don't want to come together and heal the planet. Those are also the words of the author of the article, Jerry Boyer. At the same time, Michelle Obama, before Barack Obama was elected, of course, took to the campaign trail. And I'm going to share a soundbite with you of something that she was saying about what her husband's administration will be like in your life if he's elected.
And Barack Obama will require you to work. He is going to demand that you shed your cynicism, that you put down your division, that you come out of your isolation, that you move out of your comfort zones, that you push yourselves be better, and that you engage, but will never allow you to go back to your lives as usual.
Barack will never allow you to go back to your lives as usual. I love that part. Okay, and in March 2012, as we move through the Obama administration, the ACLU takes to the newspapers the Legislative Counsel, Gabe Rotman, and says, hey, Barack Obama signed a bill expanding the power of the Secret Service to restrict speech and make arrests. So this idea of political correctness and the attack on the First Amendment, it must take place in order for the agendas that we've talked about in this timeline to be fully implemented. It's a good moment to be reminded of the words of the French philosopher Voltaire, I think, who said, to find out who rules over you, simply find out who you're not allowed to criticize. And that's your answer. Now that political correctness has really taken root in society, it's being accepted, a lot of the issues are accepted by a good number of people. The debate is supposed to be over. It's time to turn the focus of that agenda to the children, the future leaders and influencers. Karl Marx and Lenin knew this very well, right? Karl Marx said the education of all children, as soon as they can get along without a mother's care, shall be in state institutions at the expense of the state. Hillary Clinton echoed a similar sentiment when she wrote her book, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. Vladimir Lenin said, give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. And we know this to be true. There's a woman named Jane Robbins who was a senior fellow for Education American Principles Project and a retired AP US history teacher. And having been on the inside of seeing the changes in curriculum as political correctness ideology grew in our culture, she talked about what that curriculum was like in our primary and secondary schools and our high schools. And she says, rather than a belief that America has a mission to spread democracy and new technologies, the framework teaches that it was built on a belief in white racial superiority and a sense of American cultural superiority. There's a lot of guilt put into that curriculum. And it matters because it works. It also, political correctness started infiltrating our university systems, right? We see this in the news a lot. There's a documentary made by Evan Coyne Maloney called Indoctrinate You. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. In that documentary, Professor David Clements from Monterey Peninsula College is explaining what the requirements are if, as a professor at that particular college, you want to introduce a new course. And he says, if you want to introduce a new course, you must include a description of how course topics are treated to develop an understanding of race, class, and gender issues. And what's really fascinating about that is he goes on to explain that means every single course. So if you want to introduce a course about gardening, you have to put in there ways to develop an understanding of race, class, and gender issues in your gardening course. If you're teaching a math class, you must put in there ways to understand sensitivities of race, class, and gender issues in your math class. This agenda is to be indoctrinated into every single curriculum at that university. That's the requirement, and it's in writing. So here, Professor Clements shares a few of his thoughts on the impact that can have on young people.
If you can get students persuaded of a couple of basic ideas about the nature of reality, you can go a long way toward succeeding in a social engineering project in which you're engaged.
Big frowny mouth there. Thought I'd leave that. Very sad face, which I understand. So, 2014 and beyond, our education system has been impacted by this wave of political correctness and the agenda that comes with it. It's change you can believe. Our colleges have trigger warnings on written topics that might be too conservative or that don't support and promote politically prescribed narratives, politically correct narratives. Colleges have free speech zones because I guess they forgot that the entire United States of America is a free speech zone. Last time I checked the First Amendment, that was what it said. And they have things like safe spaces because the idea of people who do not subscribe to politically correct ideology are so traumatizing and frightening that you might need a safe place to go and seek counseling or get a warm hug. When I was researching for this topic, I could put so many examples in here. I could update this particular part of the presentation every single day. But these are just a few examples of how much political correctness and the expectation to believe it and conform to it has infiltrated every aspect of our lives. There's a school in 2013 that made the news because a worksheet asked, and this was a primary school, asked elementary children to remove parts of the Bill of Rights. Political correctness has invaded how we worship. School bans Christmas trees, and even the colors red and green, because that might make you think of a Christmas tree. And we would not want that. It's invaded history. Political correctness rewrites history. A Denver area students accuse a school board of censoring U.S. history. It tells us what we should say and what words we should use. University of Michigan, last year, university students have been asked to sign a pledge to use inclusive language. To sign a pledge that you will talk the way you're expected to talk. It also has dictated now what our theater and arts should be like. PC police go after Mel Brooks, the producers. And of course, attacks on free speech and even life itself. People who would express themselves freely have been in danger. And of course, as I said, sadly, there have been many other examples that I could put up here, like this one right here. And if you think all of those things are shocking, consider this. From the 1990s to now, we now have a generation of young adults who, from the time they were born, through school and college and into their early careers and jobs, have only ever known an America of political correctness. Think about that. Think about how that affects the way you think. Jay Leno explains to us how young people who are impacted by this perceive certain things. Let's listen.
Yeah, college kids now are so politically correct. I mean, to the point where, I'll give you an example. We had interns at the show, college interns. Like the last year of the show when the interns come in and said, Mr. Leno, I'm getting lunch. What do you want? I said, I don't know. Where are you going? He said, we're getting Mexican. I said, I don't really like Mexican. He goes, whoa, that's kind of racist. No, it's not racist. No, being anti-guacamole is not racist, right. Okay? Now, you have no idea what racism is. That's not racist, you idiot, you moron.
You have to laugh or you'll cry, right? Anti-guacamole is not racist. If you only take one thing out of this presentation, remember that. All right, so political correctness, as we see, right, is defining what we can and cannot say, not only in public, but also in private. Political correctness tells us what words are unacceptable. You know, you might want to get a pencil out, because I know you really want to get this right. You know, you can't say mortgage, right? Because that connotes property ownership. Ownership of land and property is wrong, so don't say mortgage. Don't say mother tongue, because that's racist. Don't say management, no, because that would denote that you have authority over another. So that's a dirty word now. And certainly, of course, don't say boy, girl, or sex, or all of that, right? They've made up new words for that. That's why there was a kindergarten last year where a teacher, I've forgotten what state it was, where a teacher said, okay, kids, from now on in our class, we don't say boy and girl, we say purple penguin. We're all purple penguins now. So be sure you write that down so you don't forget. It also, luckily, political correctness will also tell you what you should say. So don't worry about that. Don't say Columbus Day, say Explorers Day. And don't say pet owner. You're a pet guardian. Pet guardian now. You don't want to offend the pets. Don't say Merry Christmas, right? We say Happy Holidays. If someone sneezes, don't say God bless you, right? Or if someone's sick, you don't say we're keeping you in our prayers, right? We keep you in our thoughts, not our prayers, because that would be wrong. So here we are, back in the present day, back in the middle of this very long journey of political correctness development and to where we are now, right? And there are certain times in history where a generation is called upon to defend those principles which they hold most dear. This is one of those times. Liberty is hurting. That's just the truth. Liberty is hurting. Liberty needs you. And the question is, what are you going to do to defend freedom? I'm going to share with you the words of an unlikely messenger who comes in the form of an Irish rock star named Bono. Maybe you heard of him. And he tells us very eloquently and very aptly exactly what it is that we're fighting for. Let's take a listen.
Anyway, it's not a right-left issue. It's a right-wrong issue. And America has constantly been on the side of what's right. Because when it comes down to it, This is about keeping faith with the idea of America. Because America's an idea, isn't it? I mean, Ireland's a great country, but it's not an idea. Great Britain's a great country. It's not an idea. That's how we see you around the world, as one of the greatest ideas in human history, right up there with the Renaissance, right up there with crop rotation on the Beatles' White Album. The idea, the American idea, it's an idea. The idea is that you and me are created equal. It will ensure that an economic recession need not become an equality recession. The idea that life is not meant to be endured but enjoyed. The idea that if we have dignity, if we have justice, then leave it to us, we'll do the rest. This country was the first to claw its way out of darkness and put that on paper. And God love you for it, because these aren't just American ideas anymore. There's no copyright on them. You brought them into the world. It's a wide world now. I know Americans say they have a bit of the world in them, and you do. The family tree has lots of branches. But the thing is, the world has a bit of America in it too. These truths, your truths, they're self-evident in us.
An idea. America is an idea. It's an idea of freedom. And there has been nothing in the history of humankind that has been more powerful, more inspirational, or more compassionate than that. American freedom is your legacy. It's our legacy. And that's a legacy worth fighting for. Thank you.